Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Maputo 51 wash processed Ecuador from Mood Trap Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Mood Trap, based out of Singapore. And before we start this review, I must give a disclaimer, as this is technically an unofficial review, as this bag was gifted to us by Mac. So a massive shout out to and thank you to Mac for this coffee. And what that means is that this coffee is ineligible for making our favorite coffees of the month list or our favorite coffees from the entirety of 2023 list. But what happened with this coffee was that we were having a conversation with Mac about this one specifically, as this is a coffee I was extremely interested in given our previous experience with one of Mood Trap's Mejorado coffees. And Mac was gracious enough to send us half this bag of coffee. And since this is a coffee that I was extremely interested in trying out for myself, I accepted it, and we're going to be reviewing it and discussing it, especially since Mac doesn't have any connection with Mood Trap themselves. It just felt like a great opportunity for us to discuss it while at the same time being transparent about how we received it. So let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee, as this right here is day 81. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 94 degrees Celsius, about 201 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind. However, on this one, I went slightly more coarse on that grind as well. Now, roast profile for this one, as a lot of people know, Mood Trap is notorious for being one of the lighter roasting coffee roasters out there, and this coffee was certainly no exception to that, as I found this to be an extremely light coffee once again. So I feel like most people would identify this one as being on the very light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 61 first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the cup was offering an interesting mix of subtle and intense, with the focus being on the listed white florals in a slightly bitter sense, followed up by a bit of fruit depth, mostly skewing in some sugary stone fruit senses. In addition to that, it was relatively sweet and lingering, so it was a solid start. However, I must keep that in context, as relative to a lot of the Mejorado coffees, even the Morona Zamora that we had from Mood Trap last year, it was not quite as intense and prominent as those coffees have been. So while it still offered plenty of those aspects relative to, I would say, the average coffee from Mejorado, it was a little bit more on the tame side of things. Day 64 through the Chemex, and the cup continues to remain a little bit more subtle all around, with the floral aspect being the most prominent yet again, and a very slight bitterness. Once again, I'm attributing to a floral bitter aspect as well. Fruit depth is also soft and subtle, with it still skewing on the mostly sugary side of things. So I had a couple of thoughts. I was wondering if maybe it was some significant adjustments we needed with this coffee, or if, interestingly, because of the profile, it needed a little bit more rest. Regardless of what it was, I didn't necessarily feel like we were getting the best of this coffee up to this point. So on day 67, we opted for the April brewer, and this was the best the coffee had been to this point, as it was offering much more of the Mejorado-like qualities, especially in terms of the sweetness, though still relative to the average Mejorado, not necessarily quite as sweet as I might have expected. A slight bit of a honeyed florality for the first time, and a softer berry attribute. Cup is best after a lengthy cool down, lending itself towards the best day that we've experienced up to this point. Day 70 through the V60 with higher temperatures and a more fine grind. And here's where things got kind of interesting, because typically when it comes to Mejorado coffees, I've found better results from lowering the extraction. But given just how light this coffee was, I wondered what would happen if we really pushed it. And given that we only had 100 grams of coffee to play around with, I didn't necessarily like that this is the direction I opted for, but I feel like a lot of people would have been more curious what would have happened if we did push this coffee. And this is essentially what happened, was a slight bit of intensity all around relative to the previous experiences we'd had. In addition to that, a little bit more of the berry-like aspect can be felt, while it's still offering a lighter florality, with the Mejorado-like sweetness much more present after the extended cooldown. Slightly sugary, a little bit of an improvement relative to our initial impression, but I couldn't necessarily tell if that was because of the adjustments we had made, or because the coffee had a little bit more time to it. And given that it wasn't that much of a drastic improvement, I couldn't help but feel that we still weren't necessarily going in the right direction with this coffee. We tried the same thing with the Chemex on day 73, and this also felt like it was perhaps slightly improved from the earlier experiences we'd had, but it mostly still offered a bit of that generic softer floral aspect to it, with the sugariness also present within the finish. So again, I'm just seeming to slightly ramp up the intensity, which at the same time, given just how delicate the coffee has been up to this point, it needed a lot more from that. So I took a shot in the dark and we tried the opposite direction, which is typically the direction I like to go with Mejorado coffees. And on day 76, we ran it through the V60 with lower temperatures and that more coarse grind, which is what we settled on towards the end. And this was by far the best the cup had been to this point, as this is the first time I was starting to feel a lot more of the intensity, especially a lot more of the notes that were listed on the coffee itself, most notably that florality once again. In addition to that, there was a slightly bitter white floral aspect, complemented by what I would say is a much more prominent darker berry aspect, reminiscent of grape, more sweetness and a lingering sugariness this time around, especially relative to the earlier experiences we'd had, and by far the most intensity and by far the more sweetness we've experienced from this coffee up to this point. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. I don't think there's any part of that that's surprising whatsoever, especially given that the definition to the floral aspects were pretty notable. So level 4 was always going to be where this finished for this coffee. Finish level 4, and it did have a little bit of that sugary finish to it. Sugary in a number of ways, sugary in a fruit sense and sugary in that Mejorado-like sense. No, truth be told, I was expecting maybe a little bit more of a similar profile to that Morona Zamora, and that one did have a little bit more of a lingering, lasting finish, especially in a sweeter sense. And then here's probably the biggest thing we must discuss in this tasting wheel. Sweetness level 4. That is atypical of Mejorado coffees that we have reviewed in the past. As mentioned, that Morona Zamora did score what I would describe as being on a 6 for the sweetness, and I felt like this was a number of things at play, the first of which being that I didn't have enough of this coffee to really get it right, and it had potential to maybe be a little sweeter. I continue to just struggle with, I would say, the profile of this coffee, as the Morona Zamora felt a little easier to work with than this coffee did. And outside of that, I think it's really important to kind of take note of where this coffee finished, as this tasting wheel was made on the final day that we tried this coffee, which was by far the most intense it had been up to this point. So even then, at reaching that level 4, it wasn't always there. It was perhaps at times on the slightly lower side of the level 4, but it was really important to chart it there at that level 4 to mostly notate how it wasn't quite as sweet as the majority of Mejorado coffees that we do have. Florality, level 4. First note I took away from this coffee, most consistent note throughout the entirety of it, so I don't have too much to discuss on that. Slightly bitter in a sense, at times a little bit more of that honey-like florality, but definitely the most prominent component. Berry fruit, level 4. As mentioned towards the end, that grape-like aspect, that darker berry aspect became much more pronounced, and I would say at the earlier days of this one, I struggled to even gain a lot of that note within this coffee, and most of the days that we were trying it, I would say it was a little closer to that level 3 mark. Towards the end, though, it became just a little bit more prominent. A couple of level 3s, we will start with the acidity level 3. Not necessarily the brightest coffee, have mixed results with Mejorado coffees in general, as some of them do tend to skew a little bit more on the higher side of things. But this one right here, kind of surprised that it finished in that sense, but once again, don't necessarily think I ever got the best of this coffee, so level 3 is where it finished. Citrus fruit, level 3. Can't recall whether or not they had any sort of citric notes on here. I would say that this is a little bit more of a generic citric quality. In addition to that, it comes a little bit more on that citric floral-like aspect, so that belongs there. Stone fruit, level 3. Mentioned there's a little bit of a sugary stone fruit. I could say that it maybe is a little bit reminiscent of a white peach, and it could also be reminiscent of something like an apricot, but for the most part, once again, it was a little bit more subtle relative to the just general experience of this coffee, given that this coffee in general was pretty subtle. Caramel, level 3, that's that Mejorado brown candy-like sweetness, and that usually goes in a number of directions. It can be as high as a level 4. I can't recall whether or not the Morona Zamora was as high as, well, a level 4. I do know that it was a lot more prominent and pronounced than this one was, but that's the note that I was perhaps expecting the most of from this coffee. And then I think that there's only one other thing worth discussing, and that's the body at a level 2, as this one is a pretty light-bodied cup of coffee. And once again, based off an abundance of previous experiences with Mejorado coffees, that usually is the case. They don't necessarily always have the most amount of body or brightness to them. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. As mentioned, I really wanted to review this coffee for a number of reasons, and I feel like I have so many takeaways from this coffee. So let me start with some of the thoughts I had. I wonder how much of the, we'll say, traveling this coffee made had an overall impact and effect on the way that it turned out, because I don't necessarily think that this coffee turned out the way that I was expecting, and that's the other part of it is I had some really high expectations for this coffee going into it because of how much I enjoyed that Morona Zamora last year. I mean, my favorite coffee of the entirety of last year, same coffee roaster, same varietal, same origin, then the expectations for it going into it are going to be extremely high. But the other part of that is I at no point felt like I ever got this coffee to the best that it was supposed to be, as working with 100 grams can be kind of tricky, especially given that you're unsure of which direction to go with a coffee like this. And I couldn't help but feel that maybe if I had higher doses to brew with, maybe a lot more of this coffee, then I could have done a better job of getting the best of this coffee, as there was definitely potential there. And it just kind of leaves me wondering what else could have been achieved from this coffee. Type of person I would suggest this one to. I feel like if you do enjoy your lighter profiled coffees, obviously that's the first place we need to start with it. Outside of that, maybe somebody that does enjoy a challenge, because I didn't necessarily feel like this was an easy coffee to get right. That can be the case sometimes with these lighter profiled coffees, and I think that just a little bit of patience and working with it could get a lot more of those pronounced intense components, because they're there. It's just a little bit difficult to kind of pick them out, even if I've worked on coffees like this a lot in the past. This one I just found to be a little bit more tricky than normal. I think that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you enjoyed the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Maputo 51 wash processed Ecuador from Mood Trap Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.